We're on Daf Ayin Ches Amud Beis, and we are towards the bottom of the Amud. And maybe the best way of indicating the place is by counting up lines. Again, that's not going to help you unless you have standard old-fashioned Vilna shots. But in any event, it gives you an idea at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, approximately 10 lines up from the bottom of the Amud. And in our print, it starts with the line starts with the word Masechet, and we're going to zoom over towards the left, Mantana. And the Gemara now is going to bring a brisa and try to figure out what this brisa holds. And if we could align it with perhaps one of the various shitos that we've seen in the past, Mantana lahad Tana Rabbanon, who is the Tana of the following brisa? And we're talking about a Pesach sheshchato b'tara. So in other words, the carbon itself was tahar, and the bailim were tahorim. So everything is all systems go at the time of shchita. The acharkach, but sometime in between the shchita and the zrika nitmu bailim, the bailim became tmeim, so they cannot eat from this carbon pesach. And now we get into the whole question of whether a carbon pesach could be kosher in the absence of ochlim. No one can eat the carbon. And this brisa says yizarek hadam b'tara, that we find kohanim that are tahorim, and there's no problem because it's only the bailim that contracted tumah. And of course, the klishares, Rashi points out, are also tahorim. The al yechel basa b'tumah. And it's really fascinating because what this means is that we're going to go ahead with the carbon. It's a carbon pesach that's kosher, despite the fact that the bailim can not eat from the carbon. They will be yotzei their chiyuv of carbon pesach without achilas hakarbon. And even though at the time of the zrika, the bailim were not ochlim, but it doesn't matter because we hold that aim machsheves ochlim bezrika, and machsheves ochlim is b'shchita. At the time of the shchita, the bailim were ksherim, there was machsheves ochlim, and now in this scenario, the brisa would insist that the bala carbon does not have to bring a pesach sheni. So this is an interesting quiz question. You could ask a budding scholar: is there a case where a person brings a carbon pesach, he cannot eat from the carbon pesach, but he doesn't have to bring a pesach sheni? The reason he can't eat from the carbon pesach, he's tameh. And we have a parasha about Loscha that says if the person bringing a carbon is tameh, then let him bring a pesach sheni a month down the line. But this is the exception to the rule because he contracted tumah between the shchita and the zrika. And once the carbon was shechted properly and the bailim were royal achila, now the kohanim can go ahead and do the zrika with kohanim tahorim, with kalim tahorim, and the baal hakarbon was yotze yidei chovaso. He fulfills his obligation, even though he contracted tumah before the zrika, and he has no way, no how that he can eat the carbon. And the Gemara answers, Amar Abba Lazar, you should know that this brisa of a machlokes shnuya, you read the brisa and it's a stama, there's no dissenting view that's quoted in the brisa. You walk away with the misimpression that that everyone unanimously accept this brisa. That's not so. Rabbi Lazar points out that this brisa reflects a specific das yachid, a minority view, Rabbi Nasani. It was Rabbi Nassan, as you remember, we discussed earlier on this Amud, who maintained that achila eina makeves, that achilas hakarbon is a separate entity, a kiyum of yachlas abasa b'layla zeh, but it doesn't form a critical element in the akrovas hakarbon. So the akrovas hakarbon, according to Rabbi Nassan, would be valid even in the absence of ochlim. We don't have any ochlim that are uyim lechol, but the carbon is kosher. And therefore, when we get to the Zrikas Adam, according to Rabbi Nossa, we don't have to ask the question, do we have Bailim Ru'uyim Lachila or Enam Ru'uyim Lachila? Either way, we're going ahead with the Zrikas Adam as scheduled. And despite the fact that at this point, the Zrikas Adam will have no impact on the Achilas HaBasar because there are no Bailim who are Tahorim who can eat that Basar, nevertheless, the Zrika is meaningful as a clincher of the kapara sakarbon, and the carbon is kosher, despite the fact that the Bailim will not be able to eat from the carbon. So this is the opinion of Rabbi Lazar in interpreting Rabbi Nosson. So Rabbi Lazar the Amora, B'das Rabbi Nosson the Tana, is of the opinion that you, according to Rabbi Nosson, you don't need Bailim Ru'uyim Li'ochel. Now, keep in mind that we had an opinion earlier, I just want to remind you, that Rabbi Nosson also requires Bailim Ru'uyim La'ochel. And Rabbi Nosson's Kula is only if we have other problems in the Achila. Like, for example, the Basa became Tomei. But if the Bailim became Tomei, according to that understanding, that version of Rabbi Nosson, and the Baal is a Gavra who's not Royal Achila, in that case, Rabbi Nosson agrees that the carbon is possible. But this is Rabbi Lazar, who understood Rabbi Nosson as a much more radical Shita. And you may recall that we identified Rav as standing on the shoulders of Rabbi Nosson, that Ein Achilas HaBailim Me'akeves. And therefore, according to this interpretation, you don't need Bailim Ru'uyim La'achila. However, I just have to emphasize that which is obvious. Even Rabbi Lazar, in his radical, lenient identification of Rabbi Nosson, he agrees that you need Bailim Ru'uyim La'achila B'Shat Shchita. Our case, the brisa that we are identifying with Rabbi Nosson is talking about a scenario in which the Bailim were Ru'uyim La'achila with the Tahorim at the time of the Shchita. And this cannot be overemphasized, that Shchitas HaKarban requires a Bailim Ru'uyim La'achila. And the Torah goes out of its way to point out in Parshas Bo and the Parshas Karban Pesach, Ish Lefi Achlo, Tachusu Alaseh. Tachusu means the Shchita, and Lefi Achlo means that the Bailim are Ru'uyim La'achila. But what happened is, in the scenario addressed by this brisa, is the Bailim contracted Tumah post Shchita, before the Zrika. And here we have two versions of Rabbi Nosson, according to the way Rabbi Lazar understood Rabbi Nosson. Since at the time of the Shchita, the Bailim were Ru'uyim, then Ein Achila Ma'keves, and we can go ahead with the Zrikas Dam HaPesach, even though the Bailim now are Einam Ru'uyim La'achila, as opposed to the original version of Rabbi Nosson. And in that previous version, Rabbi Nosson agrees that you need Bailim Ru'uyim La'achila even B'Shas Zrika, but Rabbi Lazar is trying to square with this brisa, and the brisa says that the carbon is kosher. Now here we have a question of the Noda B'Yehuda. I'll just mention the kasha. It's almost what I call a TKO kasha. It's very difficult to answer this kasha. The Tzlach asks the following: we interpreted the Mishnah that even Rabbi Nosson would agree that l'chatchila you're not allowed to go ahead and be zorik the dam. Rabbi Nosson's breakthrough, his revolution was that b'di'eved, if the Kohanim went ahead, they shouldn't have, and they were zorik the dam, and the carbon is kosher. It's a valid carbon, even though the Kohanim should not have done what they did, and they should have abstained from doing the zrika. But if you read this brisa carefully, the brisa says yizorek hadam b'tara, b'tara meaning taras kohanim, taras kelim, And the word Yizarek certainly indicates that lechatchila. This is not Rabbi Nosson. Rabbi Nosson only said b'di'evet. And you may recall when we were discussing Rav, who again is standing on the shoulders of Rabbi Nosson, we were very amazed by the sheet of Rav, that Rav makes this fundamental distinction between lechatchila and b'di'evet. And we tried to make some logical sense out of it. So this is the kasha tzlach. And he writes, afilu Rabbi Nosson, achila makeves lechatchila. Commotion is bar liel, like we discussed earlier. And he writes, again, this is a very difficult answer. He says, achein l'das Rabbi Lazar meaning the Amora here, Rabbi Lazar, lefi Rabbi Nosson, ein din, no, there's no requirement of roy lachila lechatchila. And then again, that's very difficult because, we explained our Mishnah, how it could be reconciled with Rav Nosson. And the answer is that our Mishnah is talking about a b'di'evet situation. I don't know. Very difficult to reconcile the two sugis. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, afilu temer rabbanani. Now, Rabbi Yochanan takes upon himself a very formidable task of reconciling this brisa that we just learned with the Chachamim Shita. The Chachamim hold that achila ma'keves, and achila, royal achila ma'keves, even in Zrika. How could then this brisa allow for the Zrika to take place and validate the Karban Pesach when the Bailam at the time of the Zrika are Tmeim? On a brilliant move on the part of Rabbi Yochanan. I mean, as soon as I read this, I banged myself in the head, like, why didn't I think of this? B'tzibur, we're talking about a case where it's not Ruvain or Shimon or Levi who contracted tumah, but rather Rov Hatzibur were tmeim. And this is what's called a Pesach haba b'tumah. When Rov Hatzibur are tmeim, then we bring the Karban Pesach b'tumah, and we can discuss back and forth whether tumah hutra b'tzibur or dechuya b'tzibur. But even if I take the minimalist approach of dechuya b'tzibur, we will go ahead and we will be makir of the Karban Pesach because Rov Hatzibur tmeim. Afilu b'tumah nami avidi. We will go ahead and we'll be makir of the Karban Pesach even b'tumah. Now, it always bothered me. How do you get a situation where, like, all of a sudden, Rov the Tzibur Tmeim, you went ahead with the Shechita. At the time of the Shechita, he says it was tar. And somehow between the Shechita and the Zrika, I don't know, all of a sudden, most of the population, the Gemara tells us that when the Azara was filled up on Erev Pesach with the Makrive, the Mevi'e Karban, there were 1.2 million people who brought their Karban on an Erev Pesach, divided up into groups, kitos. Yeah, you talk about a massive number of people. And Rov Hatzibur would be more than 600,000. So the Gemara, if you recall, has a classic scenario where this came to be, and that is Meis HaNasi. If the Nasi dies, then the halacha is that the entire tzibur has to go to the Levaya. Now, does that mean that just because you went to the Levaya, you're tamei? So that depends on different dinim. If you came in contact with the dead, if you were part of this, part of that, if you carried the meter, whatever it is. But as a result of the fact that the Nasi died, we can have a situation where most of the tzibur was osek in the levaya of the Nasi, and they contracted tumah. And now we're going to go ahead and we're going to be zorik the dam, despite the fact that the bailam are tmeim. And not only that, we have to add another element to the equation, that in this scenario of tumah b'tzibur, we allow eating the Karban b'tumah. which is another quiz question. When do you find a carbon that's eaten bituma? It's almost antithetical. I mean, a tame who eats a kodshim, that's a very severe violation. And the only answer to that question is carbon pesach. There are many other karbonos that can be brought bituma because rov atzibur tmeim, but never achila bituma. We will not permit the achila. In the case of the carbon pesach, where when the Torah says rov atzibur tmeim, bring the carbon pesach, by definition, bring the carbon pesach means eat from the carbon pesach. So that this, says Rabbi Yochanan, in that particular scenario, would comply with the sheet of the Chachamim that achila makeves, you must have the possibility of achila, and in this case there will be achila. You'll ask me, how can there be achila that the bailam are tmeim? But the answer is, we're talking about a carbon that's bar b'tumah, and in carbon pesach we have a unique halacha of nechal b'tumah. So the Gemara asks, "Ibit sibra amai ein abas nechal b'tumah." Let's go back to the brisa and read the language of the brisa. The brisa says that shchato b'tara v'achar kach nitmu abaylim yizorek adam b'tara, and then, I don't know if you noticed this, the last four words of the brisa just scream out at us, and it says v'al ye'achel basa b'tumah. The chiddush of the brisa is that even though there's no possibility of eating the basar because the bailam contracted tumah, nevertheless they were yotze the mitzvah of hakrova, and the zrika will go ahead. But you just finished telling me, Rabbi Yochanan, the brisa is addressing a scenario where rov hatzibur tmeim, in which case the achila b'fa'al is mutter, and that's how you squared this brisa with the chachamim sheet. And at this point, the Gemara introduces a derabana. And yesh koch biad chachamim lakar davar min Torah. You could have a mitzvah, and the Rabbanan will tell you not to fulfill the mitzvah because they're concerned that if you fulfill that mitzvah, you might come to violate a more serious, stringent violation. Like, for example, the famous Gzeira Derabba, if Rosh Hashanah coincides with Shabbos, we don't blow the shofar. If Sukkot coincides with Shabbos, we don't take the lulav. And yesh koch biad chacham lakar davar. So there is a mitzvah here of achilas habasa b'tumah, because according to Rabbi Yochanan, the brisa is addressing the case of rov atzibur tmeim. But nevertheless, we will not allow the achila b'tumah, and that's a gzeira d'rabbanan. Shema Yitamu abaylim li'achar zrika. Now, this is very interesting. What happens? It's almost counterintuitive. What happens if the bailim of this carbon pesach were tahorim, not only at the time of the shechita, but even at the time of the zrika? And you would say the following: well, if they became tamei before the zrika, and we're talking about rov atzibur tmeim, then they're allowed to eat the carbon b'tumah. How much more so in a case where they were tahorim at the time of the zrika, they only became tmeim after the zrika. And that indeed is apparently the logic of the common sense individual. And therefore he thinks in a case where the bailam became tmeim after the zrika, he would think that they're allowed to eat the basa. But in truth, it's just the opposite. They cannot eat the basa, because the halacha of rov atzibur tmeim, which permits the achila of the pesach b'tumah, that applies only if the tumah was contracted before the zrika. And now you're going to tell me that, okay, they became tmeim before the zrika, and last year I remember the case, and the chachamim instructed us to eat the basar. Is he tama abayim liachazik v'yomesh taked last year? Loni tamnu v'achalnu. We weren't even tmeim, and we ate the pesach when the shechita was betara, and then we became tmeim after the shechita. And hashtanami, last year we ate a b'tumah. This year also, nechul let's eat the Korban Pesach B'tumah. Because here, not only was the Shechita B'tara, which it was last year, but even the Zrika was B'tara. We were Tahorim during the time of the Zrika. And yet, I'm sorry, did I say Tahorim? I meant to say Tmeim, right? So we were Tahorim at the time of the Shechita, and we became Tmeim at the time of the Zrika. That's a more severe case than our case this year, when we became Tmeim after the Zrika. And yet last year, they told us, go ahead and eat the Basa B'tumah. This year also we're going to eat the Basa B'tumah. V'lo Yadeh, and they don't realize that the difference. The Ashtaked ki is Darik Dam, when there was a Zrika Saddam. Right? His Darik is just a conjugation in Aramaic of the word Zrika. Is Bailam Tmeim Hoyu at the time of the Zrika. The Bailam with Tmeim, that's Kovea, the carbon is a carbon above B'tumah. And in the case of a carbon Pesach that's above B'tumah, it's Nechal B'tumah. Ashta, but here, Bailim Tahorim Hava, if the Bailim were Tahorim, not only B'Shas Shlita, but also B'Shas Zrika, in such a case, it's not a Pesach above B'tumah, it's a Pesach above B'tara. And now you're about to sit down at your Seder table on Leil Tesvav and eat your Korban Pesach. In the meantime, you became Tameh. You can't eat the Korban Pesach. And therefore, this was the chash, this was the Gzeir D'Rabbanan, that people would confuse a case of Nitmu Habaylim with Nezrika, if we allow you to eat the Pesach, which you're allowed to according to the Torah law, because it's Rov Tzibur Tmeim, and it's a Korban Pesach Abba B'tumah, with the situation today, this year, of Nitmu Habaylim Liachar Zrika. So therefore, the whole business of this Brisa is all D'Rabbanan. And Rabbanan are going to tell you, Shevi Altas, don't eat the basar, this carb. And even though the Torah commands you to eat the basar, you will not eat the basar, because next year we're afraid that if you became Tameh after the Zrika, you can eat the basar. So therefore, in this case, where you're allowed to eat the basar because the Pesach Abba B'tumah, you were Tmeim before the Zrika, we're going to tell you don't eat the basar. Now, there's a question here from the Gur Aryeh. He wants to know what happens in the case of Nitmu Habaylim Kodem Shchita. If, let's say, the Tumah took place before Shchita, Kevon Shebein Kodem Shchita Liachar Shchita. In our case, of Nitmu Habaylim Bein Shchita L'Zrika, it's Achiluk Nikar. He says, Shchita hitchilas has askus im karma. If it was before the Zrika, so they'll confuse it with a case of Liachar Zrika. And that tos is very common, or very probable. However, in a case where there were Nitmu Kodem Shchita, there it's very obvious to the populace, to the average person, that we should differentiate between the case of Kodem Shchita and Liachar Shchita. They're not going to make a mistake. Because as we said before, the Shchita is the beginning of this askus in the carbon. If they were already tmeim at that point, and the Pesach is Ba B'tumah, that they understand is a special category that even from the beginning of this askus they would tmeim, and yet they're allowed to eat tumah. It becomes a lot more confusing in the twilight zone to make a distinction between Kodem Zrika and Liachar Zrika. Now, here's a fascinating question. The Rabbanan said, because it is Gzeres Chachamim, you're not allowed to eat the basar of the carbon in the case of Nitmu Rov Tzibur before the Zrika. Now, if that be the case, then the Chachamim who hold that Achila Makeves, and if you don't have Royal Achila, the carbon is possible, how could Rabbi Yochanan reconcile this brisa with the Chachamim, and then insist that when the brisa says Edo Nechal V'Tuma, based on a Gzera D'Rabbanan, the carbon is kosher. How can the carbon be kosher if it's not royal achila? Brilliant question. And this question is addressed by the Achronim, and they say the following: Heich yotzim yidei chovas pesach b'korban zeh l'shitas chachamim hasovrim shachila ma'keves halo eina basar royal achila shechacham asru v'yesh lomar demikevan shu royal achila midoraisa harei choshev royal achila. Now, this is really fascinating. You know that one of the most far-reaching issues in halacha is what is the status of a doraisa? How is it impacted by a d'Rabbanan? Like, for example, at the beginning of Masechet Pesachim, you have a case of chametz d'Rabbanan, and he went ahead, he was mekadesh and isha. On a doraisa level, the kedushin are valid. And the one who wrote extensively on this topic was Rabbi Yosef Engel, one of the giants, brilliant geniuses of about a century ago and a little more. Like, for example, if let's say you make a kinyan d'Rabbanan, you know, the Dalet Amos Shel Adam Konisla, that's Takonis Chachamim in the Gemara in Bab Metzia. Can I take that object that I was koneh with Dalet Amos and be mekadesh and isha with? Does the doraisa recognize a kinyan which is only valid d'Rabbanan? And an afkamin is whether she's an Eishes Ish, tremendous repercussions. So Rabbi Yosef Engel wrote extensively on this topic. And here in our sugya, without even noticing it, we missed a very important chunk of this sugya, because Rabbi Yochanan is reconciling this brisa with the Rabbanan, who hold that achila ma'keves. And now Rabbi Yochanan is saying that there is no achila because the Rabbanan made a gzera of liachar zrika, of nitru kodem zrika to nitru liachar zrika. How could the carbon be kosher? And the only way out is to say that on a doraisa level it's royal achila. What that means is that we can judge the doraisa laws independent of the d'Rabbanans. When you want to define the carbon and whether it's kosher or not, don't ask me about the d'Rabbanans. I'm not sure, Rabbosai, if we have to draw any far-reaching conclusions from this particular case. What do I mean? While it's true that the Rabbanan said you're not allowed to eat the basar that's carbon Pesach, in a case of nitmu rov hatzibur l'fnei zrika, but what happens if somebody went ahead and he ate from the basar? Would the Rabbanan say that achil is not an achilas kodshim? For example, let's say he ate outside of the chabura, or he ate it chutz liyushalayim, or he broke the bones, and there's an isolav of shviras etzem. And I can give you a whole bunch of nafkaminas here. When the Rabbanan say don't eat it, are they therefore undermining the achila? And as far as they're concerned, this is not an achila of Pesach, when the Torah commands you to eat it, despite the fact that it's bituma? We could suggest that that's not what the Rabbanan is saying. They didn't go as far as to say that we will negate, we will not recognize this achila as achilas carbon Pesach. The Rabbanan is saying, don't do it. And the Torah says, Rasisa kol sheyeruch, we have to oblige the Chachamim. But he went ahead, for whatever reason, maybe he didn't know that he wasn't supposed to eat it, and he ate the carbon. I would say, Lefi Aniyas Daiti, it has all the dinim of achilas carbon Pesach. The achilas of shmei achila. So when you want to know if he's royal achila, and the Pesach now cannot be eaten, and what would the Chachamim say? Should we passel the carbon? The answer is no. It's royal achila. The Rabbanan never said that the achila is not an achilas carbon Pesach. They may have told you, don't eat it, but it's royal achila. Haraya, if he went ahead and he pushed himself through the gates and he ate it, it would be an achilas korban. Okay, now we're going to turn to Daf Ayin Tes. Ibais Ema. The Gemara now offers a new answer to explain Rav's Shita. Right, Rav said that when the Mishnah said, quote, Eino Zorek es Hadam, Rav said, although he shouldn't have been Zorek es Hadam, im Zorak Hurtz. And the Gemara asked the kash on Rav from a brisa, because the brisa clearly says that achila makeves. How could Rav say that b'di'evet, if they were zorek the dam hurtza? Hurtza means the korban is valid. And the Gemara gave an answer that Rav holds like Rabbi Nassan, that achila ain't makeves. And we had a whole long sugya back and forth about the shita of Rabbi Nassan. Now the Gemara says, Ibois Ema, Rav di Omar Rabbi Yeshua. Now, the Pashup shot in this Gemara is that the Gemara is saying, forget about Rabbi Nassan. You don't have to introduce this concept that Ein Hachila Makeves, and that's why Rav says, "B'di'evet, if you zorik the dam, that the korban is kosher." But the truth is, I don't think that that's pshat in the Gemara, because the Gemara is introducing Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Yeshua is also reiterating what we said in the name of Rabbi Nassan. It's only the names are changing here. The Gemara is offering a different Tana. Instead of entering into the whole somersaults in the air about what Rabbi Nassan really says, I'll show you Rabbi Yeshua, who says explicitly that Ein Achila Makeves. But it's not that Ibois Ema is offering a whole new answer to explain Rav. Rav holds that b'di'evet, if you zorik the dam, Ein Achila Makeves. But instead of attributing Rav to the shita of Rabbi Nassan, let's offer another alternative, and that's Rabbi Yeshua, who holds that Ein Achilas HaPesach Makeves. The Sanya we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Yeshua Omer. Now, this requires a little bit of introduction, but let me just read the text of the Gemara, and then we'll try to embellish. Kol hazvachim shebatorah, bein shenitma basar v'chelev kaim, bein shenitma chelev v'basar kaim, zorek es hadam. Let's stop here and give a little bit of background. And again, you'll please forgive me if I'm reviewing things that are so elementary. But I always say better chazara than to leave it out. Gemara on Daf Ayin Zayin that we learned establishes that according to Rabbi Yeshua, im ein basar ein dam, im ein dam ein basar, that if the basar of any korban became tameh, then we will not be zorek the dam, because the dam has to culminate the zrikas hadam in achilas habasar. And you may recall we spent a lot of time establishing the alfutza, how exactly Rabbi Yeshua derives this, because if you remember, the pasuk says, "Damo yishafech va'basar te'achel," and Rabbi Yeshua connects those two phrases which are written in the same pasuk. When is it damo yishafech? When it's habasar te'achel. But if there's no possibility of eating the basar, then the korban is possible, and we will not be zorik the dam. However, there are two categories of basar. There's the emurim, which are burnt on the mizbeach, and then there's the balance of the basar, which are eaten either by zichrei kahuna in all korbanos, exception of shlamim, that the bailim also will eat the korban. Rabbi Yeshua, when he says in ein basar ein dam, what he means is that there's no basar at all, and the dam is completely independent, hanging in the air, Because Rabbi Yeshua's shita is when the pasuk says "Va'basar te'achel," it's referring to any basar. It doesn't matter whether it's the basar le'emurim le'haktaras mizbeach or it's the basar l'achilas hakohen. Either way, what Rabbi Yeshua needs and requires for a korban to be kosher is that the zrikas adam is matir the basar. Which basar it's matir, it doesn't matter. For example, if nitma habasar nechal, then the dam is matir the basar nikrav that's subject to Aktara, Gavi meaning they murim. If on the other hand, they murim contracted tumah, then a basa teachel relates to the achilas habayla. One of the two is sufficient. And that's exactly what we're learning now in this brisa, that the brisa is clarifying Rabbi Yeshua's shita, that ein basar, ein dam means that there's no basar at all. No basar lachilas adam and no chelev lataras hagavim mizbech. If one of them are around, then the dam will be matir that basar, whichever basar it is. However, there are two exceptions to this rule, and that's what this brisa is establishing. Rabbi Yeshua's two exceptions. Now, the first exception is a little bit less relevant to our sugya, but if we're learning it, let's get an idea what it's all about, and that's called Shalmei Nazir. Now, when a Nazir completes his Nazirus, then he has a mitzvah which is comprised of three different elements. Number one, he's got to bring karbanos. Number two, he needs what's called giluach and shiluach sa'aro. And number three, he needs what's called tenufas hazroa. I mean, on that sugya of zroa of a nazir, you can spend, I don't know, months probably. But anyway, we're just touching on the surface to get the general idea of what's going on over here. So, for example, in Nazir, when he has to bring his karbanos at the end of his Nazirus, he brings, number one, an ola, number two, a chatos, and number three, an ayil l'shlamim. That's the most exciting of the three. And he brings chalos urikikim. Now, we're going to focus on the korban shlamim. The shlamim has a unique din that only applies to Shalmei Nazir. And that is that the Nazir will shave off the hair off his head. He's got a lot of hair on his head. And what they do is they take a big pot, and in the pot they put the shlamim, the basar shlamim, and they have to cook the shlamim. And underneath the pot, above the fire that's burning under the pot, they put the seir nazir. And it becomes almost like part of the ritual of the akravas hakorban. Now, there's another unique din that applies in Shalmei Nazir, which is one of the three korbanos he brings at the end of his Nazirus, and that's called Tnufas Ha'ayil. What part of the aisle needs Tnufa, where the Kohen puts his hands underneath the hands of the Nazir and they wave it? That's called the Zroa of the aisle. The Zroa of the aisle requires Tnufa. So the Kohen takes the Zroa. Now, again, the Yeridea part of this sugya is that the bishul of the aisle of Shlamim has the Zroa in it. They didn't separate the Zroa and remove it before the bishul. And that's called Zroa b'shelam in an aisle. And that's taken together with one of the two chalos and one of the two rekikim. And they put it on the open hands of the Nazir, and they do Tnufa. And all this is in Parshas Naso in Sefer Bamidbar. Now, what Rabbi Yeshua is going to point out is that with regard to Shalmei Nazir, and we'll get to Korban Pesach in a second, we must have the basar tahar. Why? Because at the time of the zrika, if the basar is not roy lachila, then that basar is not roy for all the other mitzvahs that we spoke about, which means the sreifas haseyar underneath this pot of bishul, because now the basar is coming, you don't have the bishul, and you won't be able to do the tnufa of the draw of the aisle. So everything that a nazir needs depends upon the process of the basar of his shlamim being prepared for achila. So here the halacha is being, now again, there's another part of the shlamim, which is the chelev, that's brought on the mizbech. So the chelev is tahar, and the balance of the basar of the shlamim is, of the aisle, is tameh. Says Rabbi Yeshua, in this case, you're out. Not because of the halacha in Kodshim, that im ein basar ein dam, because that halacha can be fulfilled, that requirement can be fulfilled through the basar that is a murim, that's niktar mal gabi mizbeach. So as far as the main basar ein dam, that principle would not apply over here. But because of the inner mechanism and the mitzvahs that apply to a nazir, if the shalmei nazir cannot effectuate the kiyum of nazirus, and the nazir now remains a nazir, then the korban has no purpose. It undermines the entire purpose of the korban. And if the basar is not tar, then these various variables, these chunks of the kiyum mitzvah of nazir will be, they're dependent upon the basar being tahar, and in their absence, the aisle itself is no longer roy lemizbeach. You can't do this zrika. Then he has osei Pesach. This is coming back to our sugya. And in the case of Pesach, it's not enough that the emurim of this lamb are tahorim and can be brought on the mizbeach. That's true for all karbanos, but not in the case of Pesach, because we must have the basar la'achila. That's the agenda, that's the purpose and the goal of the Korban Pesach, to set up achila. And if the basar that's nechal is makabel tuma, then the deal is off and the korban is passed. So these two cases of Shalmei Nazir and Korban Pesach are the only exceptions to the rule that if there's basar li murim for the mizbeach that's tar, the korban is kosher. These are the two exceptions. It's not sufficient to have the basar of the murim tar. We need the basar nechal to be tar. And in that absence, it's possible. Now we go on. Nitma chelev ubasar kayo. In the cases of Shalmei Nazir and Korban Pesach, if the chelev, that's the emurim, contracted tumah, so we have no aktara of the chelev, but the basar is kayo, we have the basar for all the mitzvahs of Nazir, and we have the basar for the mitzvah achilas HaPesach, zorek es adam. Go ahead and be machshel akrov. However, nitva basar v'chelev kain, if the chelev is tar, but the basar is tameh, eno zorek es adam. Because we must have, it's absolutely critical, it needs two karbanos, achilas habas. Oh, now here's the punchline of this entire study of this brisa, this long brisa that we've been studying of Rabbi Yeshua. Ve'im, meaning even though, im zorak, he violated, meaning there's no basar lachil. There's only a murim tahorim laktar al gavi mizbeach. He went ahead and he was zorik the dam, which he shouldn't have done. Hurtza, olah hakarban l'ratza. The carbon is valid. And why is that? Now, in the case of Nazir, we have to come to a pretty radical conclusion. And that is that the mitzvahs had Nazir are not ma'akev in the carbon. The carbon remains independent as a separate entity, which can be valid even if there is no possibility to be Makayim, not the din of Sreifas HaSeyar, and not the din of Tnufas Zroa Ha'ayil, all that has to do with the mitzvah of the Nazir, but it doesn't have to do with the Kashrus HaKarba. And if he, again, we're not going to be makar of this carbon, and the zrika is absolutely a no-no. But if the Kohen went ahead and he was zorik the dam, the carbon is kosher. And the mitzvahs ha-nazir are not makvos. And hu adin, the same applies to carbon pesach. If nitma basar, and therefore the basar is not roy lachila, we will not be zorik the dam, because the whole agenda, the purpose of the carbon pesach is to be mata achila, and here we cannot be mata achila. However, if he went and he was zorik the dam, then the carbon pesach is kosher because the dam is mata de murim, and a murim are tahorim, and will be mata de murim on the mizbeh. So we see clearly that even though we need bailim ru'uyim lachila b'shas zrika, and if the bailim are not roy lachila because they were tmeim at the time of the zrika, we will not allow the zrika to go on. But nevertheless, it's not makim in the Pesach, and if the zrika was done by the Eved, the carbon is kosher, even in the absence of achila. So we see that Rabbi Yeshua holds that ein achila makeves, and that would be a source and a basis for Rav's conclusion that nitma basar im zark adam kosher hurza, and the carbon is kosher by the Eved. So when I walk away from this sugya, I think, very often this is the way my brain works, of a quiz question. Could you have a case of a carbon pesach where the bailim were tmeim at the time of the zrika? There's no way they can eat the basa, and the carbon is kosher. And the answer is, in the light of our sugya that we just finished, if b'di'eved the kohen went ahead and it was zorik the tam, the carbon is kosher, but only if they murim are tahorim. So the basar is tameh. And again, I should have introduced this question by saying that we're holding now, like Rabbi Yeshua, then ein basar ein dam. So we need the basar. You'll tell me as basar murim, that's not enough, because in the case of carbon pesach, I need basar lachila, and now the bailam are not ru'im lachila, they are tmeim. And therefore, you and I would have said the carbon is possible. And in fact, Rav and his predecessor, Rabbi Yeshua, would say, don't be zorik the dam, but for the ever they were zorik the dam, and the carbon is kosher. Now we go back to the Mishnah, and the Mishnah says, "Ubimukdashim enokein." I'll read the next part of the Mishnah. He says, "V'chulei ela afal pisha nitma basar v'chelev kayim zorek es hadam." So in all karbanos, as a general rule, we will allow for the zrikas hadam, even though nitma basar, because the chelev is kayim. We're not totally dependent upon the achilas basar. We have the achilas mizbeach through the aktar of the emurim, because the emurim made the tar, and that's enough to be zorik the dam, even though the basar is tar. The Gemara points out, Masis and Mani Rabbi Yeshua. This Mishnah should be attributed to Rabbi Yeshua, who holds that im ein dam, I'm saying im ein basar, ein dam, that we won't be zorik the dam if the dam can't be mata the basar. And the Mishnah is pointing out that, which we've discussed many occasions, that if there is some basar, even if it's the basar of haktar al gabi mizbeach, then the carbon is kosher. And the Gemara now quotes a brisa to embellish and clarify the Shita Rabbi Yeshua. This Sanya we learned to the brisa Rabbi Yeshua Omer Kol Hasvachish V'Torah Shenishtayr B'Hem Kezayis Basar O Kezayis Chelev Zorik Es Hadam. As we said before, the dam has to be matir basar. Which basar? Doesn't matter. It could be the basar of haktor al gabi mizbech, meaning the chelev, or it could be basar nechal al yidei adam. But there has to be at least a kezayis of basar. Otherwise, it's not called an achila. If there's an kezayis of this basar or that basar, irrelevant, then zorik es adam. And here we want to quote the pasuk in Dvarim Yud Beis. It says, "V'asisa olasecha habasar v'adam." And Rabbi Yeshua has an equation between basar and dam, and they become one entity, and you cannot separate them. If you don't have the basar, you don't have zrikas hadam. However, if you have a kezayis of basar, that's considered basar. So when the Torah says v'habasar v'adam, it means kezayis basar. Kechatzi zayis basar. If you have a volume or an amount of basar which does not lend itself to an achila, because we have a principle ein achila pchutza mi kezayis, or for that matter, you have a kezayis, a chatzi zayis of chelev laktor al gabi mizbeach. So there too, there's no achila. And let's add the following: he's got a half a zayis of chelev and a half a zayis of basar. Can we be mitzarif the two chatzi zaysim and consider it as royal achila because there is a kezayis? No way, no how. Eino zorik es hadam. Why? Because there is no achila. We have two different achilos, each of which is on a half a zayis. Neither of these achilos qualify as an achila. And when we derive from the pasuk that a basar te'achel, we need an achila. You can't be mitzaref the achilas mizbeach to the achilas adam. Ubi ola. Now here's where the din changes. Ola, as you know, is kulo kolil. There is no basar achila, so it's only basar laktara. Is afilu kezayis chatzi zayis basar chatzi zayis chelev zorikas adam neshekulo kolil. Everything is going to go on the mizbeach. It's not two fundamentally, categorically different achilos. It's all one achila, the achilos mizbeach. And in achilos mizbeach, we're mitzaref two chatzi zaysim to make up a full zayis. So we have a half a zayis of basar, half a zayis of chelev. All told, we have a kezayis of basar shen niktar al gabi mizbeh. So therefore, we have a clarification through this price of the Shita Rabbi Yeshua that if you don't have either a full zayis of basar achila or alternatively a full zayis of chelev laktorah, then you cannot be zorik the dam. The carbon is possible. Now let's see if we can find a parallel set of halachas with regard to menachos, where we're not dealing with dam at all. So in the case of a mincha, we have number one, kmitza, and then we have shirayim. Kmitza is kolil al gabi, is muktar al gabi mizbeach, and the shirayim are nechalim lezichrei kuhu. Ubemincha, says the Brisa, afal pisha kula kayeves lo yidra. There's nothing left to the basar. There's nothing left to the chelev, and we're not going to be zorik the dam. What's exactly going on here in this price? Mincha maya vidita. The Gemara tries to now clarify the end of this price with regard to mincha. Well, what's this business here about lo yizrak? I mean, there's no zrikas dam in a carbon mincha. You can't take this price so literally. I mean, what do you mean dam? Nizrak hadam, lo nizrak. I mean, well, what dam are we dealing with the carbon mincha? He points out here in the footnote in the name of Rabbeinu Gershon in Masechet Be'ila that there are 5 different karbonos of mincha. There's a minchas soles, a minchas machvas, minchas marcheshes, Minchas mafet tanur, and mincha haba min harakikim. Some come b'neder, some come in a dova. But what's common to all these menachos is that there's no zrikas hadam. So we've exhausted every single last category of mincha, of menachos, and we didn't find one that has a dam. So what's this zrikas hadam business? Omar Papa. What's the case in this price of minchas nisachim? So we're talking about menachos that accompany karbanos. And again, we have a whole list of karbanos which require nisachim. For example, karban ola requires nisachim, and a karban shlomim requires nisachim. So he's got, on the one hand, a soles blula b'shemen lemincha. He's got yayin l'nisachim. The mincha, meaning the kometz, is burnt on the mizbeach hachitzon, and the yayin is poured on top of the mizbeach. And this is all explicated in the Torah itself, Torah Shvichsav, in the 15th chapter of Sefer Bamid. So what happens now? Salke dait chamina. I would have thought keva deka asya mikach zevach is kegufe de zevach dami. Since this mincha is coming to accompany a zevach, then the laws of the zevach should now, by osmosis, impact on the mincha. The mincha is now being elevated to the same status as the zevach. Now, there's nothing left to the basar of the zevach, and what he's left with is the mincha. Now, you can only eat the shirayim of the mincha if there was a kmitza, but now we're saying something else. It's not enough to have a kmitza to be matir shirayim of a mincha. You also need the carbon of the zevach, since the mincha, as we said before, is upgraded, so to speak, to the status of the zevach itself. And therefore, kigufe the zevach domit. We're going to treat it as we would treat the zevach. And therefore, I would say, and this is the havamina, that if there's nothing left to the basar, that shouldn't bother me. Why? Because I still have the mincha. And now the carbon itself could become kosher. Do you hear this, Rabbosai? A pella of a havamina, but even a havamina in the Gemara has to be appreciated. The havamina is that the zevach becomes kosher without basar, and the principle of Rabbi Yeshua that im ein basar ein dam does not apply. Why? Because you have shirayim of the mincha, and since the shirayim of the mincha, which is like the basar of a zevach and it's nechal lekahuna, becomes mutter as a result of the akrovas hazevach, then the zevach itself and its rika is matir basar. Not really basar, because we're not talking about basar, but we're talking about the shirayim of the carbon mincha. A mashmalon, the Tana wants to tell me, no, the zevach lechud and the mincha lechud. And therefore, even if you've got plenty of shirayim of the mincha, if there's nothing left in the basar carbon, you cannot be zorik the dam. Now, I was hoping we'd get to the Mishnah, but I don't want to push it into 2 minutes. There's a whole sugya before the Mishnah, so we'll leave that in Mitzvah Hashem for tomorrow. Let's just make a note of where we got up to. We're up to Chelev Minola, here on the top of Daf Ayin Tes Amud Aleph. So I wish you all a great day, and thank you so much.